Hey. Hello again, everybody. Good afternoon. So I hope you all enjoyed the lunch and the drinks. And so I'm delighted to restart our event for a new session, this time on AI and copyright. And that conversation will be led by my colleague, Professor Michael Geist, who is the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law and the full professor in the Common Law section at the University of Ottawa. Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully, I think you can hear me just fine. Thank you. Thanks so much, Florian. Hopefully, everybody had a nice break and a good lunch. I want to start just first by thanking Florian and his team that have put together just an incredible event. Many years ago, when I was much younger, I had the energy to put something like this together, and I know what it involves, and it's an amazing achievement. So thank you. We're going to deal with an issue that I learned last night got boring for a while, apparently, and is now interesting again, which is AI and copyright. Kate Crawford said copyright had ceased to become interesting for a while. I never got that memo, I have to admit. But nevertheless, it unquestionably, I think, is incredibly interesting and challenging right now. I think that we're just coming off a panel talking about privacy, and you can think about some of the core implications from that AI brings from a privacy perspective. It seems to me AI sits there on a copyright, and AI kind of it's there again and again and again on so many of the really hard questions as we see some of these issues evolve. And in some ways, I think it is very much on the front lines, not necessarily from legislators' perspective. It feels like sometimes they're a bit scared to deal with some of these issues, to reopen some of the copyright debate, but certainly some of the litigation that we're seeing and some of the media focus oftentimes goes directly to copyright. So there's a lot to try to sort through. We have a spectacular panel to try to do that, and we're going to try to make it as conversational as possible rather than kind of going from country to country talking about what's going on. We want to be able to focus on a range of issues, and thought that the framing that we might use, borrowing from Woody Herzog's presentation in the first panel this morning, is one based on inputs and outputs. Thinking about the copyright implications on the input side, and then thinking about the copyright implications and AI on the output side. So that's the plan. Let me quickly introduce my panel. Some of them have already been introduced, and others who don't really need any introduction, but I'm going to give one quickly anyway. To my immediate left is Karis Craig, who's the Associate Dean, Research and Institutional Relations at Osgoode, an Associate Professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, and the Director of IP Osgoode. I get tired with just reading all of those different responsibilities, but thank you for joining us. To Karis's left, we have Sergio Branco, who we've already met earlier today, co-founder and director of the Institute for Technology and Society in Rio de Janeiro, ITS Rio. To welcome again, Sergio. Thank you for participating on this panel as well. We have another repeat participant in Caroline Nakube, who is Research Chair in Intellectual Property, Innovation and Development in the Department of Commercial Law at the University of Cape Town. Welcome and thank you. And last, but certainly not least, we welcome Christoph Geiger, who is Professor of Law at Luis Guido Carli University in Rome. He is also right now Global Professor of Law at NYU University, and he's also the President of ATRIP, focusing on bringing together the academic community on IP. So a great panel. To get us started, we thought we might focus, as I say, first on the inputs. And for a long time, when we started thinking about input-related issues and machine learning and making use of materials, the focus was very much on text and data mining exceptions. It was often much of the discussion. It's still a bit of the discussion, sometimes in Canada referred to as an informational analysis exception. Christoph, maybe you can get us started with talking about those exceptions, other potential limitations and exceptions, and where you think they stand as people become more and more aware of AI and its implications.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, just kick it off by ask the main question that we have for those that were not aficionados in copyright law is whether training machine learning model is subject or not to the exclusive rights. And in worldwide we have different models when it comes to exceptions and limitations. We have the question whether it is a fair use to train an algorithm, or a fair dealing, or in the European Union, we would look at specific exceptions, limitation. You just mentioned text and data mining. That's what we have in the current context. In the EU, we introduced two specific exceptions for text and data mining in 2019. But that was before the boom of generative AI. And I remember I did the report for the European Parliament on the evaluation of the exceptions. And I was telling them, are you aware that by regulating text and data mining, you will regulate artificial intelligence? And everyone was silent in the room looking at each other. And they didn't even see that this was a topic of interest in this context. So now it's a little bit a paradox that, in the current discussions we have in the European Union, should training algorithm, specifically in the context of generative AI, be subject to the exclusive right? Everyone jumps at these provisions and say, well, we have a framework of reference and we have to work with it. By knowing that it was not meant to regulate this specific topic. So I think there are two options on the table. Either, we try to squeeze this in what we have, and the same will be in other regions of the world. Is this a fair use or not? And, courts will soon have to decide according to the various criteria in the US, and in Canada that will be the same. Or we come up with something new, and there is already push from, either the global tech industry or the right holders. The users are not so much active so far, but there's really, everyone is kind of on the table of policymakers and trying to push for his solution. So maybe we'll come back to that later on what can be these solutions, but either we try to fit it in what we know, or we come up with something new. I think that's the challenge.
Before we leave that, can you just expand quickly on, you mentioned at least two sides that have been quite vocal and active. What do we find that they're typically advocating for?
Well, the tech industry would and also a lot of scholars, especially in the US context, would say this is a clear fair use, a free use, because we know also it's either black or white in the US. There is not so much anything in the middle. The content industry, and particularly in Europe, and in Europe they are more powerful actually than the tech industry when it comes to a push for certain solutions. They argued that this should be subject to the exclusive rights. There's even a proposal that has been tabled a few days ago in France that proposed that the output of an AI-generated work should be attributed to the authors that were used for training the AI. That means you would have an AI-generated works with thousands or even 100,000s of authors potentially, and this subjected to collective management organizations. Others are pushing for a general opt-out of the text and data mining exceptions. The French collective management organization SACEM already announced that it would opt out from all text and data mining exceptions in order to push for exclusive solutions. So we are really here between a fight between, will we submit this to exclusive control, or will we keep this free? Or maybe there is something in the middle. Maybe we can get back to that later on.
Maybe we can. For some of the other panelists, are you seeing some of the same kinds of debates taking place where you're at, and some of those same kinds of tensions? Caroline.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that the text and data mining exception is dead, and long live text and data mining exception. So I think that's where I have a sense we are. So a lot of African countries have gone, not a lot, a handful, have gone through recent copyright reform processes, but they haven't even waded into this debate at all. But I also know that at the continental level, for example, the African group at WIPO has got a proposal that seeks to resuscitate some of these debates. Hence, it's dead and long live. Yeah.
Sergio, anything in Brazil?
Well, in Brazil, we've been discussing for a long time the reform of our copyright law. In fact, about 13 years ago, we had a very good, very well designed and very well publicly debated bill of law that ended up not being voted. So we have the same law. Our law dates from 1998. And in my opinion, many disagree, but in my opinion, it's completely outdated. We should review our law. But the problem is that our problems are piling up because the reform we wanted to go through 13 years ago was to include more limitations, for example, because we think, me and many people, and I think the Brazilian delegation who is there agrees with me, but we think that our law needs more limitations. Because when we look at our law of 13 years ago, there was already a kind of, it's unbalanced when we see the internet and the uses of works on the internet, and many things that we do now are illegal because the law says it's not legal to do the things people do. So we wanted to have this review of the law, which did not happen. When Marco Civil was approved in 2014, there was also nothing talking about civil liability because the copyright law was being debated. So they said, oh, let's not talk about copyright here. It should be on the copyright law. So Marco Civil doesn't have anything about civil liability for copyright infringement on the internet, and we don't have the copyright law talking about this problem. So we have a problem with limitations, we have a problem of civil liability not being on the law, and now we have to discuss artificial intelligence, you see? So we didn't solve any of our recent problems, and now we have a new problem. And I mentioned before today the AI Act, and in fact, there is only one article in the Brazilian Bill of Artificial Intelligence, and it says, roughly, it's not an offense to copyright the use of works created by artificial intelligence, like the extraction, reproduction, filing, and transformation in mining data systems and texts in systems of artificial intelligence in the activities conducted by organizations and institutions of research, journalism, museums, archives, and libraries, as long as they don't have as the objective of reproducing the works. The use of the work is necessary to get the objectives that are aimed. It doesn't harm the economic interests of the holders of copyright, and it doesn't compete with the normal economic exploitation of the works. Okay. So this is what we have so far, but it's really far from being debated or being transformed into a law.
Okay, I think I just heard the three-step test thrown in there, but
exactly.
Karis, as some of you may know, I'll throw it in just a sec, but as some of you may know, the Canadian government just launched a consultation on copyright and these issues, I think just in the last week or so. The deadline is the first week of December. They previously had launched a consultation that included text and data mining. What's your thoughts now? Is that first consultation on text and data mining in Canada dead? Are we likely to move in another direction? Share us with your view.
Yeah, I think what we have in Canada is a really good example of the perils of waiting. Sometimes wait and see is the right policy approach, and other times like you miss a moment and then you find that the whole landscape has shifted. And if you are of the view that copyright should not be the regulatory tool that determines the future development of artificial intelligence, which I am, then I think that we had a moment in time where there was just, as you suggested, this momentum behind the idea that text and data mining should generally be lawful. Maybe it would be a circumscribed limitation, but nonetheless that there should be an exception for text and data mining so that you can train AI systems. And that seemed like low-hanging fruit in terms of copyright reform. We had an Indu committee review 2019 where this was the recommendation. We should be adding an exception for informational analysis. Obviously, I don't remember that part being particularly controversial. And then, as you say, in the 2021 consultation that we had, it was prominently featured in the consultation paper. There was the idea that a text and data mining exception or an exception for informational analysis would probably be forthcoming. And then nothing happened. And then the whole landscape and the conversation around generative AI shifted. And suddenly the idea that copyright might be the tool that could bring AI to its knees, that it could be the tool that could make or break the future of AI, made it suddenly seem like a very tempting avenue, right? That you could actually use copyright to in some way ensure transparency, control, to put up guardrails, to limit the development of this technology. And we've seen this happen before, of course, with other technological developments. Copyright is a tempting tool because it's a big, blunt instrument that has a lot of power behind it. But right now, my concern is that that moment has passed. And I was looking again at the second consultation paper that just was released this past week. And you can see just in the framing of the issues, a significant shift in the language around it. And the big framing is in considering possible copyright policy options related to AI. The government will aim to balance two main objectives. One, to support innovation and investment in AI. The second one, for our purposes, to support Canada's creative industries and preserve the incentive to create and invest provided by the rights in the Copyright Act, including to be adequately remunerated for the use of their works or other copyright subject matter. So notably absent in that is any mention of user rights, limits and exceptions, the public domain. It's about owners' rights, and somehow the right to remuneration is brought in here as the framing objective that is going to inform the government's response to the consultation submissions. So I think the ship may have sailed.
No, I think you're right. And it does serve as a reminder, especially for those here in Canada that are interested in these issues, that we're on the clock a little bit with the opportunity to ensure that our voices are heard, no matter your perspective on this and many of the other issues. Now, closely related to that is a lot of the focus on the development of these large language models, LLMs. And we've seen certainly many of the larger companies that are creating and then using these LLMs sort of liken what they are doing to search indexing. They say basically the same thing. In fact, I have a podcast, as some may know, and I had Aiden Gomez, who's one of the founders of Cohere AI, and we talked a bit about this issue, and I must admit, he almost seemed a bit puzzled that I'd be asking this question. He was like, how is this any different than what Google has been doing for a very long time in indexing? And if people don't want their stuff indexed, use the robot.txt functionality. Caroline, maybe you could tell us a bit on where some of this debate is happening, both where you're at and more broadly.
Yeah, sure. So I very much liked what Carrie had to say about the narrative and how the second consultation puts the question across, right? And how there are missing parts in the narrative. So I think that in South Africa, we are at a similar place. So there's been a lot of media interest. I read 2 weeks ago in one of the most widely read national papers, the Sunday Times, about how the books of two very well-loved national authors had been stolen. And this is because their work has been found to be part of the 183,000 works that have been used by the data set. And so I was just reading, so that narrative speaks about the missed moment in copyright reform, because we've literally almost just come to the end and none of these questions actually came to the fore. So there's a sense of a missed opportunity, and there's also a sense of seeking some remedy. So I was very interested in how this remedial action was framed. One of the authors was quoted, and he spoke about how his work had been stolen and that he's thinking now about actually launching a copyright infringement suit. And then he also says, okay, I think I'm also going to align myself with the Authors Guild because they've got a class suit, and so I think I can benefit from that. So lots of stuff going on in there. National debate starting, also trying to keep abreast and perhaps seeking remedies at a global scale. So I find it really, really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. Anyone else following this closely at all in terms of what's been happening? We certainly have seen a number of these class actions. I've seen some speculation about follow-on class actions in Canada potentially taking place, raising questions both about what that outcome might be and then barriers to entry for other players, depending on where things go. I'll open it up to anyone who has any thoughts.
Well, in Brazil, I think artists are very worried now. The debate is about the use of music and audiovisual works on social media, internet, like Instagram and TikTok and etc. So the debate is much more related to the use of creative works by the platforms than artificial intelligence itself, but it's coming together, like, the platforms are getting a lot of money through the usage of our works, and it's even worse. Now we have artificial intelligence, but the only thing related that I can remember related to artificial intelligence in Brazil that was publicly hugely debated was the creation of an advertisement for a car that used the images of a very famous Brazilian singer who died 40 years ago. So there was a duet between her and her sister, her daughter, who is also a singer. Now she's an adult, of course, and they sing together a song, and then everybody discussed the use of the image of the deceased singer, but it was much more on the usage of the image than the artificial intelligence itself. It was, is it respectful to use her image or not?
Okay.
I was just going to add on the this point about the fact that the focus is now on arts, like visual arts, on music and collective litigation being brought by groups of artists who can identify as such. The thing that makes me nervous about this is that there's an assumption, and it's one of those sort of common misunderstandings about copyright, that it only attaches to things that are really art, original art by real artists. And if that's what we were actually doing, then we could talk about how best to ensure that real artists actually get some benefit from the use of their works in competing products that might undermine their market. But that's not really what copyright is doing, because copyright attaches to pretty much everything that's ever written, every email, every Reddit post, every selfie, everything that's out there becomes a copyrightable work. So what you do to protect the worthy graphic artists to make sure that they're making some income in the context of an AI marketplace is going to turn into a regulation that absolutely affects every aspect of training artificial intelligence from any possible source. And the distortive effects of that are enormous. The unintended consequences of that are enormous, because you're going to end up with only a few big players who are able to navigate that regulatory landscape, who are able to clear those rights. And in the meantime, it's going to become almost impossible for smaller players to continue to innovate and to move into the space. And so I worry that there might be some complacency around this, because the big players and the powerful players don't mind trying to navigate that landscape. They know ultimately they're going to be the beneficiaries of it, but I think there's going to be a lot of harm done by all of the unintended consequences, because we're distracted by the idea of the graphic artist and what they deserve in the context of an AI marketplace.
Okay. That's really valuable. Did you want to jump in?
So I would add that I think we need to differentiate a little bit between the use of AI for generative AI purposes and the use for AI in the context of search engines. I mean, you just mentioned the impact on the cultural ecosystem will be much more important with regard to generative AI. And so there will be, no doubt about that, loss of incomes for artists in the context of a post-pandemic difficult situation already, and this will be some arguments that policymakers cannot ignore unless they open the pockets and and redistribute more to authors. It's very unlikely that it would happen. So I think this argument is on the table, and I think we can also not ignore, when we talk about copyright, that there might be a little bit of distributive justice rationale behind it still, at least in the European Union, it's very clear that the experience we have with certain exceptions, such as the private copy exception that generates income which is redistributed to the creators, whether you like it or not, there is this rationale that is there, and we might consider, and at least I have argued this, to transpose that model of private copying and to free from authorization the machine learning process, but at the same time, when there is commercial gain, have a little portion redistributed to the author. That would be actually, I think, the only way forward in order to avoid an all or nothing scheme. I'm saying this because I'm coming from a region where it's very likely that the pressure of the content industry will lead to submit machine learning to the exclusive right. And if this happens, this will kill any kind of startups trying to establish itself in the field of AI. I'm very worried about medical research. I'm very worried about research users in the context of generative AI, but also about how artists in the future might want to use generative AI in order to develop new forms of creativity. It's controversial, but a couple of days ago, an artist, Refik Anadol, has had his art acquired by the MoMA in New York, and he uses artificial. I think it's the first big museum acquisition of AI, at least where the AI helps to in the creative process that has been getting such exposure. So I think we're going to see more of that coming in, and we cannot close the eyes to that kind of argument. So yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, we've had this argument before, so I won't rehearse it here. But I do just want to flag that I think this is absolutely the critical question, right? And it's the thing that's happening in the tension between Europe and the US, and that's sort of a race in terms of like who's going to regulate this how. But if Europe decides that there's a compensable right that is implicated in the training of artificial intelligence, then the collective management system takes over, and there are ways in which that can be managed. I'm not sure that it's practicable or feasible, but at least there's the infrastructure and the practice already established there. If that becomes the model and that becomes the baseline that copyright is implicated, we're going to have huge problems over here in terms of working out what collective management would look like in that context. And so I'm really worried about that first step. I think redistribution is well and good, but you can do that through a basic tax system where you tax the people who provide the technology, and then you fund arts and culture through public funding.
All right, so the copyright debates aren't about to get boring. Christophe mentioned the acquisition of AI-generated works, and so this allows us, I think, to segue into the output side as we start thinking about what gets generated and some of the copyright questions. On that front, Karis, can you talk a little bit about, you've been prolific in this area, talk a bit about AI-generated works and copyright.
Thanks. Okay, so this is where I came into artificial intelligence, was when Ian Kerr convinced me it might be interesting. And he was a very convincing person, so I had lots of what we called Ian Kerragement to start thinking about artificial intelligence, and so I did. And we wrote this paper in 2019 called The Death of the AI Author. And the argument was basically like that there's no such thing as an AI author. And as was true of much of Ian's work, we wanted just to begin by recognizing what the technology can do, what its promises might be, but also what its limits inherently are. Right? And so his point was just ontologically, a machine cannot be an author, because authorship is about creativity, authorship is about expression, it's about communication of meaning, and none of those things can be attributed to artificial intelligence by definition. It doesn't answer our copyright conundrums, but it starts the baseline. Let's just not mistake what we're looking at. Let's not make the category mistake of thinking that the AI-generated works are creative works, that they're expressive works, that they're works of authorship, or that the machine can be an author. And then we can talk about, so when is the person using the artificial intelligence sufficiently involved in the output that they can be an author? Then we can talk about, what do we do? Do we want to encourage people to use AI to generate works? Do we need a different system in order to do that, or do we not? But that baseline was set, and AI cannot be an author, and I think it's a really important starting point for this conversation.
Is that consistent in some of your countries as well, in terms of where the debate is at, or even where the law has been at?
Well, no, I totally agree with what you said. And first of all, I'm very happy that after so many years, we are not discussing this using the self of the monkey, because we've been discussing Naruto's picture for many years, and now we moved forward. And I totally agree, there is no way that an artificial intelligence system can be the author of something. We would have to reveal all the copyright structure and history to grant a copyright to an artificial intelligence system. And this would also lead us to the discussion of granting a personality to an artificial intelligence system. And from many debates we've had in Brazil, I don't see any possibility of that now, or any reason. I don't think it's useful. Of course, I don't know, I don't want to enter history like Sergio, that conservative who never wanted to grant personality rights to, and we never know what's coming in the future. But now I don't see any possibility of that. And I've been reading about this topic for many years because I work with copyrights, and it seemed that many people agreed that a work created by artificial intelligence system would be in public domain. And those who don't believe in that say, oh, but what would be, if it's in public domain, then there would be no incentive for the industry to create systems that would create works. But all the idea of incentive to create works is not related to industry, it's related to humans. So I don't know if this argument is that strong, but a few months ago, I read a very interesting text from Lawrence Lessig, in which he says, it's a very short text, in which he says, well, the originality standards required by granting authorship are so low that we could grant authorship to a human who made the prompts, who said, well, I want a picture with these characteristics, or a text with these characteristics, and this would be good enough or enough to grant this human copyright. I think this is very interesting, what he says, because at least if we escape from the public domain solution, it's okay, and much better than that, we don't grant authorship to, or copyrights to, an artificial intelligence system. So this is something that made me think. I hope this can make you think also.
Yeah. So I think that in South Africa we're very much in the same kind of space. And I was just thinking about the USPTO's recent guidance when they spoke about this in relation to a very specific, well, it was sparked by a specific piece of work. And so I was, in my jurisdiction, obviously AI would not be an author, but there is a clause in the Copyright Act, a definition of author, and specifically when they speak about computer-generated works. And so a lot of discussion, a lot of academic discussion has been about how that would almost solve or provide a temporary solution, if we like. So the author then would be, in that case, the person who's used the AI to generate the work. And so the debates are very similar to all of the other jurisdictions, yeah.
In the EU, it will be rather similar as well. I guess we don't have a registration system, but if we would have had, I think the decision would have been very much in line of what has been decided in the United States. Which brings me to, we have the same unwritten criteria that the creation needs to be coming from a human individual. But having said that, there are many stages where there could be human intervention in the AI process. And here, that's the gray zone we're going to face in the future. For example, the AI produces an output, and the author is kind of editing it, using parts of it in its creative process. Where do you draw the line? When do you admit that there is sufficient human creativity that could trigger a copyright protection? Or what actually can you maybe exclude? Maybe we should also think about creating some explicit exclusions for machine-generated works. If it's a consensus among society, we should not rely on unwritten concepts of copyright law, but we should, like in the European context, we know this from software patents. They are excluded as such from patent protection. Why not do that in the same line for AI-generated works? So the gray zone, I think, will be where the real stories will be happening, probably in courts in the future, and we will need to decide when we accept it or not. I think we should require that the input of the human is predominant. I think this is a little bit what we can see surface from the decision of the US Copyright Office in Théâtre d'Opéra Spatial that said there is not enough human in this creativity because it was not purely AI generated. There was some human intervention, but it was not sufficient. And I think this is what probably should be the guiding criteria in the future, a predominant human intervention over AI machine-generated content.
You go quickly respond? Yeah, go ahead.
On that point, I think this is absolutely right. I think that the gray area is going to be so significant, especially as AI tools are increasingly integrated into every platform that we use to do our own creative work, that the capacity to parse things and just say this is AI generated, it's out, this wasn't created with AI and it's in, is going to become almost impossible to manage. Never mind impossible to discern as a consumer or a user who's encountering a work and knowing if it's AI generated or not, if the default shifts. So now things may not be protected if they are, but how do you know? I mean, it's just an incredible conundrum. And so I think ultimately a choice just has to be made. Do we carve these works out because a substantial contribution was AI generated or more than de minimis? I think is the way that the US Copyright Office is thinking about it now, that would be out. Or can we rely upon disclaimers so that you can pull pieces of the work out? Now, we all know in copyright law that not all of a work is protected, right? Always elements of a work were unprotected, so it's always been messy, but I think just on the kind of scale that we're talking about, we're going to have to arrive at a better conclusion than parsing the AI-generated elements of a work from the human-authored pieces.
Oh, I think that's right. I want to open up the mic, so feel free to make your way over there if you do have a question for our panelists. Before, as Jeremy races there, before I take a question, AI is often, the discussion around AI and creators right now is very much focused on AI as a threat. But I was talking earlier with Sergio about the opportunities that come here as well. AI is an opportunity for creators, and perhaps you can share some of the more optimistic take on what some of this might mean from a creator perspective.
Yeah, I've been working academically recently with a company that wants to develop personal AIs. So you remember the case of Drake, the singer who had a song. He never sang that song, but it was created by an artificial intelligence system. And it was not him. It was not his real voice because it was not him singing the song. But still, you had there the video of him singing a song. And what this company thinks, and it makes sense because everything is, in copyright, everything is a kind of business model. We have to think about business model. And what they defend is the idea that if we have these personal ID systems, if Drake had his own personal ID system, he could license the system, and everybody who wanted to interact, making derivative works or original works, taking into consideration the database of Drake's real works, it could use a kind of Creative Commons license. So he could say, well, if you create a work with my artificial intelligence system for your own purpose, for private use, it's okay, no problem, you can use. But if you want to have a commercial use, then you should or you must share the profits with me and with the company who made those artificial intelligence systems available. So this is a possibility. Of course, we could have thousands of personal systems working at the same time, but once I read, and it's true, some people were complaining, oh, I sing on the internet and nobody listens and I don't get money. Well, what I read was, when you have access to internet, it doesn't make you a musician or a novelist. It makes you a person with access to the internet, and talent is something else. So we might have thousands of those systems, and some will make profits and some will not. But this is how life is. So this is a possible use of artificial intelligence to be kind of controlled and used for the benefit of the creators.
Okay. So some people starting from the bottom and then they'll be here.
Nice.
Thank you very much. What a great panel. I would invite the panelists' comments on remarks that were made at the Creative Commons Global Summit that happened earlier this month in Mexico City. And members of the CC Global community wrote a long post. It's on the Creative Commons website. I just want to read just 2 sentences and invite the panelists to comment on this. This is background considerations around AI and creativity in the commons. While the ability for everyone to build on the global information commons has many benefits, the extraction of value from the commons may also reinforce existing power imbalances, and in fact can structurally resemble prior examples of colonialist accumulation. Noting that this issue is especially urgent when it comes to the use of traditional knowledge materials as training data for AI models, and noting that the development of generative AI reproduces patterns of the colonial era, with the countries of the global south being consumers of northern algorithms and data providers. So that's just part of a longer statement, but I think it's a really important issue, and I'd love to hear what the panelists think about that and how they engage with those challenges.
Who would like to get started? Caroline?
No, not yet. I'm still thinking.
I don't mind.
What's that? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So thanks, Jeremy.
Are you done your thinking, Karis? If you're done, you go first.
And I can say a few words also.
Oh, everyone wants to jump in. Okay.
Okay.
But we'll go Caroline, and then.
Okay, cool.
And then
Okay. So I'm thinking sorry, let me start again. I'm thinking about this in terms of being a bit of a copyright trap, right? That there are so many good reasons to resist and to worry about the extractive power of artificial intelligence, the way it is going to narrow our worldviews, the way it is going to reproduce sort of hegemonic westernized culture through its models. Like, I'm very worried about the cultural impact that generative AI will have and what that means for equality, for diversity of thought and viewpoints, and for challenging knowledge hierarchies. Like, I think there's really a way in which it's going to reinforce existing knowledge hierarchies in a way that can be very damaging. I don't see that copyright is the place to turn to fix any of that. And in fact, I worry that it backfires, because I think if what you do is you use copyright to control what goes into the system, you narrow what it's being trained on. The fact that it's being trained on primarily Reddit materials extracted from US users in English is already what produces a lot of the bias in the narrow worldview. And so if you limit what goes into the system, you limit what comes out, and if it's going to become as powerful as we think it's going to be in the modern marketplace and modern culture, then what you've done actually is you've extracted a whole sort of diversity of viewpoints and a much more inclusive worldview from the models that we're now using. And so that's my biggest concern about approaching this as a copyright problem. I think we just need to avoid the copyright trap and focus on questions like consumer interest, equality, diversity, all the other areas that might have a more nuanced approach to this problem. Sorry.
So I appreciate the need to avoid the copyright trap. I like that idea, but I also want to kind of echo or reinforce that idea that perhaps the way in which AI extracts value from knowledge that is owned by a lot of typically vulnerable communities or people. It could be the small-scale creative companies, small startup. It could be an indigenous community. I think there's a lot of vulnerability and that we should perhaps rethink our focus, our emphasis on that some of these things are always open and so they're ripe for the using. I think we actually need to be a little bit more careful about that. And also, even as I say that, I'm thinking that whilst there's huge risk, huge vulnerability, there's also huge opportunity for startups, small scale, they could also use AI to leapfrog whatever they're doing. So it's a very tight rope to walk, I think, and I'm not sure what the solution is, but perhaps, as Carrie says, maybe avoiding copyright as the focus of how we engage with this and taking it broader might actually help. Yeah.
You want to quickly add?
No, I think let's go first.
Okay.
So I kind of feel like he sort of took my question, but not entirely, because for me, I was coming at it more from an Indigenous data sovereignty perspective, where it's not about excluding stuff altogether, but the notion behind, so for example, we have like Michael Runningwolf talking about AI and Indigenous languages and who gets to decide and so on and so forth, right? So basic idea behind Indigenous data sovereignty is free, prior, and informed consent, and nothing about us without us, ownership, control, access, and possession belongs to the community, right? So traditional knowledge, language, stories, they're all kind of a cultural property, for a lack of a better word. So when I hear your point about the copyright trap, but I'm almost wondering about it, if we look at other analogies before Gen AI came on the scene, when we think about the ways that intellectual property regimes coming from the West, for lack of a better term, would take things like traditional knowledge and then create a property right out of it that they didn't really have, but because this was the regime that they were running, they could then assert that. We've seen that happen with stories that have been documented, the Indigenous communities who have shared their stories for the purpose of preserving them in writing and then having an academic institution slap copyright on it. So if we bring that now to Gen AI and scraping and all of this other stuff, there's been a lot of talk in Indigenous communities, people talking about Indigenous data sovereignty and the tensions between open data and data sovereignty not being one about ownership per se. I mean, I guess ownership is part of it, but this idea around self-determination and how it undermines your self-determination if someone's just going to go ahead and treat your stuff as public, do whatever they want and say, yeah, this is the Navajo language, or this is, whatever. So my question for you, that's my long build-up, is now that we have an opportunity in our discussions around copyright and how we want to revision it, if we do, are there certain things that we have to carve out as not copyrightable in the sense that they already have some kind of collective ownership or property right or some kind of right of self-determination such that if someone does come along and try to assert a property right over it, they can't because the community has not accepted that? Is there any talk happening? Are these two sides talking at all is really what I'm getting at with copyright law.
So I will take a little bit a broader approach and link it a little bit to the copyright trap discussion. We should not forget that, so there is concerns about sometimes the misuse of certain works in the training process by communities, but also by certain authors. For example, if you're an author of a newspaper article or even of a novel, and your machine learning process is trained in such a manner that it comes up with racist messages or discriminatory messages, etc. There is a legitimate claim from a moral perspective as an author to say you don't want to authorize this. And here I think we could fall back into another discussion to see how much the moral right can play a role in this conversation. And I think too often we focus on the exclusive remuneration aspect, but what about, maybe this is an aspect of copyright that can be helpful in this conversation, which is, a little bit more broader than the question of, how can we protect certain appropriations in the context of AI, of things in the public domain, but the moral right here, I think, has been too little discussed, and maybe there is space for that.
Okay. Anyone want to add anything quickly? And if not, I'll go to one more question because we're about to wrap up. Okay, go ahead.
I think I may be picking up the thread that's already started, but you mentioned AI as an opportunity for creators, and I was thinking of like in terms of things like the origin of hip hop and sampling, like in order to have access to copyright as a system where your work is protected, like it presupposes a level of public trust that like you would believe that the government would protect your work. And then it does that bring, and I take Karis's point that maybe this is a larger conversation than simply like looking at the copyright structure, but I guess like in the sense of, I should have written this down better. So I guess like when we're talking about, AI as an opportunity for creators, I think when I mentioned sampling, that idea had come up for me because part of the use of sampling in hip hop was due to a lack of access to like the specific kinds of instruments that like quote unquote valid forms of music were being created from. So like if you are part of a group that doesn't have traditional access to some of these things, if AI is suddenly kind of democratizing the creation of materials, like does that put us in a place where we're kind of through copyright law defining what kind of art is worthy of protection?
Sure.
Two. Okay. Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I love the question. It's a very good question. And I think you answered it well as well. But so let's just say to begin with that I agree. And I think that there's actually a lot to be learned from the history of hip hop and copyright in that context, right? The use of new technologies to create new kinds of musical expression in that case, and dance, and like a whole different kind of culture that can take off because of this technological affordance that wasn't previously there. And we saw then the use of copyright law to kind of to tether it, right? To return it, to keep it, to rein it in. And that changed the evolution of that musical form. And so I think that's a real lesson for us about what not to do in the face of this new technological challenge, right? To basically say, this is the kind of art we value, these are the kinds of artists we value, this is not, this is something else, and so we're happy to create laws that will prevent that from thriving. I think that's a real risk. I think this is generally a good news story for the objectives of copyright law, right? Like that you have all of this new capacity for creativity, these new creative tools, you have all of this new material that could be in the public domain, like that is now circulating freely and can be used and reused in new creative enterprises. That's what copyright is supposed to be for. And the whole incentive story was always, well, the costs of expression are so great that we need to make sure that people can get those costs back or they won't invest. Well, now the costs of expression are significantly lower. Sometimes they're essentially nothing. And if that's the case, then maybe we don't need copyright to encourage that creative expression. And so maybe that's a wonderful thing.
Okay, all right, well, you know what, if I can get off the stage on an optimistic note, I think I probably should, especially given that I'm getting the wrap-up sign as well. So I think it's fair to say copyright was never boring. It is definitely not boring now, and this panel is testament to that. So hope to join me in thanking all the panelists for a really spirited discussion.